I'm going to share my screen. We're going to go to the next module in your syllabus and begin looking at any questions from last week's materials or last week's discussion, especially in the area of rubrics for rigor. So Suzanne, you're the only one here that we will, or did I get, I believe we might have another one.
I'm back, Dr. Yuri. I'm sorry. I had some new headphones, these Bluetooth headphones I was trying out, and it, for some reason, cut me off the call. So I had to call back in. So I'll use those another time.
That's fine. Yeah, I noticed you left 3 times and came back.
Sorry, little technical difficulties.
That's all right. Now, well, tell me, do you have any questions about the material out of the curriculum rigor section? I know there's a lot there.
I didn't have any questions per se, other than just kind of like what I mentioned the last meeting that we, or the last class that we had, was that I was very excited that we were learning about it, and also that you were talking about Bill Daggett, because I had the opportunity to hear him speak, and we are planning to do some work with our staff at our school around rigor and around a lot of the information that we heard when Bill Daggett spoke.
That's great. Well, I think you got, of course, you already have found some purpose and meaning in that, and I'm glad to hear that. One reason I want to include it in this course is that we tend sometimes, when we're identifying these curriculum issues in our buildings, we talk about student performance, student grades, and that's something for us to focus on, obviously, but the rigor gives us some real understanding of what might be contributing or not contributing to the learning itself. So I'm hoping this group of you, this particular semester, as you're examining these curriculum issues, you link that back to what you think is observable, what you think is an actual cause of that.
Mm-hmm.
For example, if student learning, if you've identified, and most of you did identify scores of some type, if you are talking about student learning and exactly where is the student learning issue. So if it's not well developed, then we don't have active engagement, or we're not actively engaged. Then as you look at this part 2 of this particular evidence, then addressing the issue of student learning at whatever level it is, this will help you look at, is it the engagement? Is it the inability to respond to rigorous questions? Is it not being able to take ownership of their learning or develop their own learning tasks to stretch their own creativity? So the language here is something that you can use as you're summarizing, finalizing, and making recommendations. And so we know this is research-based from a standpoint of the thoughtful learning, the type of questioning, the academic discussions, meaningful work, resources, and learning connections.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of dealing, in this class with the rubric, I would recommend that all of you keep the rubric close by for that opportunity to not only sound, but make a more valid interpretation of what you think the issue might be. I mentioned last week too, I ended up putting this back in today's, this Marzano cheat sheet. I called it that. Marzano didn't call it a cheat sheet. I could have put Cliff Notes, I guess, would have been a little bit better. I like having this with me if I'm doing a walkthrough or if I'm doing a full observation. So if you're examining learning and examining activities in a classroom, and want quick responses or quick things to respond to, then looking at the verbs and looking at the types of questions. So I gave you this from Marzano's work, and I know most of you are familiar with this, either in other courses or in your professional training. I actually sometimes go in with a list of verbs from different levels, such as the levels in this particular taxonomy, and I will actually put a mark when I hear that verb. And in conferencing with the teacher, and I'll say, for example, I heard the word list 3 times. I heard you say interpret 1 time. Obviously, we're looking at getting down to some of the integrating verbs. I heard you give a command to modify or modifies a material or create an original document. Then there's no question about, instead of saying, you didn't take these kids to a high enough level of thinking in order to get the most from this experience, you're very specific in terms of these are the research-based action words that are important in each of those levels. That's not to say that you're not supposed to have define, label, recognize, describe, and those things in that lowest level of thinking. But it shouldn't be all in that level, and this should be an opportunity. We would think the foundational teaching or foundational material, you get knowledge and organizing type questions. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, sir, it does.
What I want teachers to begin to do is not only recognize their own use of these action words and their own use of trigger questions, but recognize those in each other, so that as we have teacher leaders or teachers in real learning communities, they're able to help each other and have those kinds of conversations that contribute to a more in-depth learning experience. With that said, I think I alluded to this last week, and so you do have it now. That I blacked out the school system this actually came from, but that's not really of any significance. But this is a evolving document that we're using in that particular system for looking at lessons, either walkthroughs or full sit-ins or any type. I have found there's all too often a checklist, even computerized checklist, where certain things are like the look fors in the far left column, that we're just putting checks to say, yes, this happened. So is the standard and essential question line and postage? What we're finding is we're given a check mark for essential questions. The depth of an essential question is the alignment between what is supposed to be learned, what is asked, and what standard does it address. So we've changed those look fors from something that maybe is a little bit too simple to something that's more significant for the learners themselves. The ask about column here is a list of questions for follow-up discussion, either teacher to teacher in a peer review, observer to teacher in a walkthrough, or a sit-in observation. And there's no, this not all the questions. I have to post this at where we were at one time. We probably have double the number of questions in these columns, and you're not going to ask all of them. You're just going to decide the ones that are most important. This takes more time. It is a little more cumbersome to sit with a teacher after you've done a peer observation or done an administrative observation, or however your observations may be designed, and ask that question in terms of, where did you get this lesson? Was it one handed to you? Did it come from a book? Did you create that? And really, there's no this is not a critical question as much as it is an understanding of where it did come from and how valuable that source might be. How did you determine the learning goals? You're looking there for teachers to be able to identify the standards, identify maybe even the particular competencies within that standard, or maybe even behaviors within that standard. So if we can identify how we came about the learning goals, then it means that we have a good understanding for what the standard asks for. Same thing with how did you determine the essential question? Instead of just having an essential question to have one, or to have one that might be a little vague, or have one that's not aligned to the standard, then we're asking teachers to think about the source of that question, which you would have to go back to the standard and the identifiable constructs within that standard. How do you know the students know what they are learning? What are the demonstrations of learning you were looking for? Give me some examples in the classroom of where that was proficient, maybe not proficient, quality, not quality, higher level versus a lower level. Some other things in that's a snapshot of the overall view of the class. And the environment itself gets to the specifics of what went on within that lesson. And I won't read all these to you because certainly you can read those. What I think would be valuable to us as a class and valuable to you as an individual is to think about these questions and how they apply to you. Think about the questions as they apply to others, and think about the questions as they may apply in your learning communities, and have some input from teachers in terms of what else do you think would be valuable in creating the highest quality lesson. What could you reflect on that would make a difference? So we divided these in categories: an overall snapshot view, the particular learning environment itself, the level of engagement, and then identifying those specific strategies and looking at the assessments. The assessments then could go back to Marzano's list of question stems. Or the question stems can also be found in the strategies section. This is a fairly extensive way of reflecting on a lesson to build knowledge within the teacher and also build knowledge within the observer. I found the more times I do this, the more I begin to learn about what needs to be asked and what needs to be observed, versus the coding technique of having a list of things that you're checking off on. And I probably shared with you, it bothers me a little bit. I'm working in a school system with the entire teaching staff, and their walkthrough observations is the bullet, I don't know what you call radio bullet types of checking things that are seen. And then there is no follow-up conversation. Somebody pushes a button and a scoring of those occurrences are sent to the teachers. So they get a score on what was checked off. Maybe they check off higher order learning strategies, yes or no, versus how did you determine that this was a higher order learning strategy? What was the goal of that higher order learning strategy? How did they use this particular strategy to gain depth of knowledge or something along that line? We got to get deeper into the learning aspect to make value of the time we spend observing and spend reflecting. Suzanne, you got any questions or comments on that?
I think it's a great tool. I'm going to talk to my principal and see if we can go ahead and use this, because we're doing our second round of observations very soon. And so I think this definitely is valuable, and just getting the teachers to reflect, because I think a lot of times teachers think that they're engaging students and think that they're, especially our higher level learners at our school, more work does not always mean engagement, and we're trying to get them to see that. So if we use some of these questions and had these conversations, we may be able to help them see that.
I think so too. And if you do have that discussion, and just stress the fact that these are examples. You're welcome to use any of these, because basically I own them, so I'm giving you permission to do that. But they could be altered a little bit. So it should be some conversation with some group to decide what's important for us to ask. This is just some things that generate some thought. I found it to enhance that common language among teachers, so that this is something every teacher should be able to sit with another teacher and have a good in-depth reflection on, and then everything will start getting better. I saw some numbers on this. We did a pre and post comparison with this exercise having been included in it. There was a 27%, the rubric, there was about a 27% indicator of student knowledge, and it went all the way up to 63% on this particular measurement in about maybe 6 to 8 months time. And all the simplicity of it is, what it does, it just creates that common language. When I showed you last week the pyramid chart on the components of developing a culture, then this is the driving force behind the language that everybody should know. Keep in mind, those of you that in this class, as we talk about this also includes the students. You would not leave the students out. You need to tell them these are things we look for when we look at each other as teachers. And we want you to understand your role in that. We want you to understand the value of this too. We really want the students to begin to challenge us to do a better job in the classroom.
Dr. Uri, I think we use a version similar to that, maybe not quite as detailed as that, but I can tell you that looking from the standpoint of the schools who actually make comments back on their classroom walkthroughs, I'll be honest with you, I think that they're obviously having more success at those schools. And that's one of those situations where it's not necessarily a score, but the teacher does get, I saw this in your class, I saw this in your class. I mean, those check boxes are there, but again, there's not necessarily a score associated with it. And then the principals who take the time to type up a note more specific about something, and then when they actually have those sit-down conversations later, especially the ones that they're coaching closely with, I feel like we're seeing more growth in those schools than we are the places where principals just walking through and using the tool just to click it off. But I will add that this year, to take that a layer deeper, because our district was working on our diversity and inclusion work, we kind of went through that cheat sheet that you shared with us right there and put asterisks or indications on anything that had to do with diversity and inclusion. So because there were so many of the ones that were on there that would actually, they were part of this 27 things that you're supposed to be looking for in diversity and inclusion and restorative practices. So that was good for teachers to be able to see that, hey, we're doing a lot more of this than we realize, and it's just helping us add another layer too.
Yeah, that's a great point, because all this is not about trying to catch somebody not doing their job. It's all about validating what we are doing and reflecting on the impact of that, and talk about how we can make it even better. That's an excellent point. And I've seen your walkthrough. It is much more developed than what I've seen in others. I just have a trouble with that example I gave you, where we're just hitting buttons, radio buttons, and then we get a tally and we send a tally out, and people think because I got 80 on my tally sheet for the walkthrough that I'm doing a good job. And it might be. That's not to say that it's not, but it's not a guarantee that learning is occurring at that level. And I know we're hurt for time, we're spread thin with a number of people who can get out and do that in the classrooms, but it is so important. I worked with a school one time for about 5 years, and I may have given you that example. Uh, there were a principal, two assistant principals, and a curriculum specialist. So one of those four people saw every teacher every week. Not a week went by that there was not at least a walkthrough by one of the administrators. That probably happens in a lot of places, but also the administrator required themselves to have a follow-up conversation similar to what this particular monitoring instrument was. And so the teachers knew that if someone came into their classroom, they were going to get some feedback on it that week. That I was amazed to see that happen. If you told me that just on the outside without going in and observing it, I would say it's humanly impossible to do that many. But when you divided the number of teachers by four, it wasn't that bad. We just had to prioritize what we're going to get done, what needs to get done in order. And so it became part of the culture. If I told you that story, I don't remember how much I told you. That school went from 35 or 37% proficient to 73% proficient in 1 year. And a new principal in 1 year who instilled this. She used Max Thompson's work in learning focused schools, and that's part of what that program called for. Burnout, I don't think so. And what my observation of that was very rewarding to both, especially as I saw the kids start learning better and involving the kids in their learning. And they had requirements that you don't want to get too scripted, but they had things that were non-negotiable, such as the essential questions. And I did an observation. I remember it it's been several years, but it's just so ingrained in my brain. A teacher started talking, and a student raised his hand and says, "You didn't tell us what the essential question was." So I said a while ago, don't leave the students out. There was a student saying, "You haven't told us what we're going to learn today. We're used to hearing that every day, every class." So the culture is not just teachers changing their behaviors. It's about all the learners in that environment having a focus and an emphasis on where you're headed. Anybody else? Normally, Kit. I need to get me a gallery view so I know who's here. There we are. 3 of us. We tripled. Along that same line, I've added some notes that were not here. So if you go back to Canvas, this is some more common language indicators for you. I think we as educational leaders have to talk about the learning culture. I had lunch today with an assistant superintendent, and she used to tell me about the program in their system. They call it opportunity culture, which was about opportunity to learn by the students and the kids. And I was a little fascinated with the slant on that from these notes, particularly on learning culture, to an opportunity culture. And I think it sort of encapsulates the fact that every day we walk into a classroom, there is an opportunity for these things to happen, and we have to have a culture whereby we're looking for those opportunities. There were many more specifics to this particular program, but opportunity culture was about conversations between teachers about what happens when there is an opportunity for someone to take advantage of this. what I've given you here is indicators of what you can look for in a system, as well as, and that system being a full system or that system being the school itself. And so part of that common language is talking about obviously mission and vision. So if we don't really know what a vision is, or if we don't really know what the vision for the school is, and to have a conversation about whether or not you have a clear vision for the future, then we can't make value of that particular activity. An example I ran into recently was not with a school setting, was in a law enforcement setting, and we were talking about the same thing. What is the vision? What is the vision of what will you look like in 5 years? What will this police department look like 5 years from now? And we're 35 or 40 officers in there, but we had one office person who managed papers or whatever she did, and she raised her hand. She said, "I can't participate in this. I'm not one of them." And that just demonstrated to, I think, what we have in schools sometimes, that vision is not necessarily shared by cafeteria people, bus drivers, custodians, assistants, or clerical, whatever we have. So we say that it has a clear vision. We should probably add here a clear vision that is shared for everyone in the organization. We talk about vision and mission a lot, but I don't know that we do the depth of it in terms of the value of that and leading us for the future. And what we don't do as a whole is we'll talk about a vision, but we're not really aligning it to what the future may be. And that's an important part, is to, before we even identify the vision, make sure we identify what the possibilities for the future might be. We'll fall back on technology when we do that. I think virtual learning is a key part of that. But the future is also about robotics. It's about being able to have holograms into the classroom. It's being able to travel different places virtually. And to apply that back in the setting where this lady tried to take me to task on that, policemen don't realize what's going to happen in their job, like teachers don't really recognize what's going to happen in teaching profession in the next 5 to 10 years. And some of the things we're going to have to change in terms of how we learn, what we need to know, what's valuable to us. And that doesn't sit well in the culture, especially in the law enforcement culture, to talk about you won't be doing the same job in 5 years that you're doing now, and it'd be much more aligned to the needs of the community. And we as school people are going to become very isolated in the future, even more so than we are now, as we're offering virtual classes for students. I know at least one system where seniors can take about any class they have at home or virtually, or some go to a virtual site. I'm not opposed to that. Don't mean that in a negative way, but it changes the way we teach, and it certainly changes the way we socialize. So this list of things is for leading discussions with teachers, and say having a clear vision and a shared clear vision of the future is important. Where do you think we're going to be? And what helps us get there? What's help us not get there? There it is. Right. Are the employees and volunteers committed to the mission of this organization? I do a lot of work in cultural development. I showed you the pyramid last week, and the beginning point of any cultural analysis and cultural change is to examine the mission of the organization to make sure that it is embedded with the values of what's important and what people agree upon as being important. That the identification of that and trying to reach that point then becomes a vision. That's what we should see ourselves in 5 years is a completion of the mission of the organization. I think all too often we are too generic in our mission statements. So if we're talking about a learning culture whereby there is increased critical thinking, higher level, higher order thinking, and the things that we identify in our rubric literature, then that should be part of what we say we're all about. So that the mission should support and hold up what it is that what is important to us and what we are striving to get done every day. I've done this I didn't do it in public schools because we had too many required summative evaluations, but at higher ed, we rewrote our mission statement at Gardner Webb, and then when I evaluated a faculty member, we put the mission statement on the table, and my evaluation for this individual was, tell me how you supported this mission and give me evidence of how that happens. So if we had a well-defined mission and we work toward that mission, then everybody has to contribute to it. Everybody has to have the vision for what you want to be. And so there are some critical conversations that come out of that. Now, at higher ed, you can do that because you've got such well-defined curriculum and syllabi versus in public schools, we're stressing the standard itself. But I think the words like enhanced learning, higher order thinking, critical thinking, and creating learners who facilitate their own learning versus preparing students for the 21st century. And that's probably in 50 or 60% of all mission statements are a contributing citizen. And that's not to say that's not a good thing, but if we follow a mission that changes the level of learning, then we will obtain those particular overused or too generic terms. I feel very strongly about we need to have more conversation about who are we, what do we believe in, and what can we do. Another checkpoint is the commitment to continuous learning. And we're talking specifically about adults who are always learning more about the trade and more about who they are and what they're capable of doing. Leaders are continually being developed. I think it was Fullen who says the biggest weakness of schools is that we don't have a written plan for creating leaders. And we have some PD, we have some people who are directing some things, but I've gone into a lot of systems and say, can you show me your written plan for creating leadership and especially for future roles? And we get things like, well, we've got opportunities for people to substitute as assistant principal. We've got team leaders. We got learning community leaders. And those are all good things. But until we get it written and defined with accountability measures, defined with specific outcomes, and so that we know whether or not we're making an impact with that, I think that's what Fullen meant by the lack of written examples. So I do several law enforcement groups, and they have a rank and order system, and you can get promoted. You got certain things you got to pass off to do that. but they're not building leaders in terms of leadership principles, not just policemen, but leaders themselves. I'm fortunate to work with the local Shelby Police Department. This is my third session over the last 5 years, what we call part 1, part 2, part 3. And this is a chief who is committed to building leadership within the ranks of his individual, in addition to all these skill sets and rankings. They're of course they're spending time with me. We're having some critical conversations about their leadership skills and what it takes to influence people and build relationships, especially relationships in the community. It's a lot of fun. There's some angry people though, usually, well, not many. We'll get occasionally we'll get I would say 2 or 3 out of each group are so militarily focused, and that's not a bad thing either, but so militarily focused, building relationships with each other and building relationships in the community is not part of what they think is important. I don't know if I was trying to think, does that apply to teachers? I have seen isolation among teachers who is their way or no way, and they've always done it this way. Another checkpoint, these are all checkpoints. Organization is always looking for ways to use resources more effectively and more efficiently, whether that be human or physical resources. If you ask people in the organization, would you change this organization if it would help us better meet our mission? Or are they committed to that change? Everybody would say yes, but when it comes down to it, if you're not willing to do that reflective practice and collaborative work and sharing your best practices, then you're fighting against what it would take to change that. So we have to really examine how we answer this question. Does your school board pay attention to enhancing overall performance? They certainly look at the scores. They certainly look at the priority and the rankings and that type thing. I would guess we have very few school boards who really understand learning and learning theory. They're just looking at those final numbers, and so many of them have different agendas that this is not priority on their list. So we have issues there. Got to cut my phone off. Uses its own experience to learn how to perform more efficiently. We're doing better with that. Data analysis, data alignment, goal setting, judging ourselves against our goals. There has to be in a real learning culture, there has to be an opportunity for teachers to talk about what did work, what didn't work, what works better. And our learning communities have to be more than agenda driven, but have to be about the needs of the kids. Evaluation is a part of every program and operation of the organization. We'll all say yes to that. I think that's gotten a whole lot better. But we do get caught in this trap where the evaluation is only looking at, yep, this was where our goal was. Yes, we made it, or no, we didn't make it. That's part of the evaluation, but the real assessment piece of that is, why did it work? Why did it not work? And where do we want to take this to the next level? So while evaluation is a part of it, maybe the quality of the evaluation itself and what is intended for that would be something that needs to be looked at. Employees and volunteers receive appropriate orientation and training. I think it's appropriate. My experience, and I'm guilty of this, is that we try to do this in 1 day, 2 days, or 3 days, or beginning of school, and we might do it once a month. Orientation and training should be ongoing, and there should be input and reflection on how that impacts the organization itself. Organizational results using organizational planning. I think we're much better at that as we're using EBOS data and other kinds of data within individual systems. It would be my personal experience to caution people to make sure you look at key performance indicators. We're doing this project in Tracy's school now, helping the schools self-assess themselves on how well they are carrying out the goals and how well they're helping market their system. And it's to create, what we're doing in this first year is to have them look at their own behaviors and habits, become creatures of habit that constantly look at the key performance indicators. Certainly scores are an indicator, but a key indicator of any score is what the skill set necessary to reach a necessary score versus just the score itself. So even in judging how well we communicate with the community, for example, we can get data that says we do or don't communicate to whatever level, but a real indicator is what happens as a result of that communication. In order to make change in evaluation goals, we must be measuring the things that make a difference to whatever the goal is. And we've got to be better at that. There's a lot of literature, a lot of research out there now on how to develop key performance indicators, and the impact that it has on performance. Employees and volunteers are clear about the link between what they're doing and strategic goals, who contributed to what, and what were the indicators, and what are we actually measuring, and what are we actually driving ourselves to do, or making sure we're contributing. All individuals engaged in action learning mean we're looking at things that we're doing and we're judging the impact on it and making decisions about what could be done better. Work teams are engaged in action learning. I know we have PLCs, and PLCs have really gotten better in terms of functioning as a team. The opportunity to offer action as a way of having an opportunity to engage in that action and then looking at outcomes. We have to be a little careful, but we're not flexible enough sometimes to take a chance on some things we need to do. In all the research that I've chaired or participated in over the last 18 years, I had a lady looked at impact of teachers' reflection on their professional development and how that professional development changed their classrooms. And most of our PD programs, we either bring in a program that has an agenda or direction, scope, and sequence, or we bring in an expert. And blah, blah, blah. This lady brought a group of teachers together. She sent them out an email and says, I want to meet and talk about professional development needs. So they all came in with their paper and pencil, waiting for her to say, here's what we're going to do and when and who's going to do it and that type. She got them together and said, here's the deal. You're going to talk together and analyze your scores and analyze your classroom environments, and then you as a team will determine what you need as a team. Then you're going to put it in place, and then you're going to decide whether or not it had an impact on learning in the classrooms. We'll meet, I think she said we meet every week or maybe every 2 weeks, and we'll talk. And after we finished the research, the data on that was to go back and just do interviews and focus groups. And the target of our focus groups or the interviews or that whole data process was to say, what did this do for you as a teacher, professionally developing yourself? Tell us about this experience. And there was such depth and volumes of positive things that came out of that. People were in control of their own professional development. They had to have the skills in assessing where they were. They had to have skills in finding solutions to the issues they needed to deal with. And they had to have skills in determining what impact that had. And so they became experts in the areas of themselves and contribute to the group itself. We followed up or continue to follow up on that and do year after year or semester after semester interviews and focus groups to see the long-term impact of what that happens. And I've talked to a number of superintendents about this, and I found very few who are courageous enough to turn professional development over to the teachers. Can you imagine how inexpensive it is to put teachers together in groups and say, develop yourselves? Of course, it's got to be monitored, that kind of thing. But we got more out of that that costs nothing but some time and would have bringing in somebody. This lady I talked to today on opportunity culture, they paid $400,000 for a group to come in and facilitate that work, which may well be worth $400,000 when it's all said and done. What this lady did in this school system costs nothing but what time it took to come together and some energy and effort. Effective leadership is recognized and rewarded, especially at the teacher level. Organization works with the community for mutual learning. That's a difficult, depending on where we are, where our community is, their knowledge base on that. But we've got to do a better job of expanding that culture outside the walls of our building. Committed to building its capacity to be effective over the long term. If you look at Fullen's work on sustainability, it says that the best way to sustain any initiative is through deep learning. Well, that's a little vague, but deep learning means we know what we're doing, how we're doing it, why we're doing it, what the impact is. As we develop those insights into that, then we'll have a better chance to sustain the capacity that we may get to build. That's really how part of this cultural pyramid I shared with you came about. Is I worked with this lady in Charlotte for 5 years, and it made such drastic improvement. The deep learning on that was the common language drove their ability to communicate and help each other. And then the relationships that they had with kids and the relationship they had with community, and the expectations. These are non-negotiable. This is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. This is built around this particular language. So that capacity was about learning in those three areas: relationships, common language, and expectations. Organizations' products and services match what clients and consumers want. We ask them a lot of times. The shortfall here or the caution is to make sure clients and customers know what products should be achieved. Resources align with intended outcomes. Efficiency studies are difficult. There are formulas and algorithms and some of those things, but to be able to tie to a specific learning outcome sometimes is not the easiest thing to do. Learning and improving permeates everything we do. Back to that reflection piece. Questions or comments on this? I would use this just for prompts for discussion. and say, okay, what do you think? Why do you think that way? And decide, get to some point where you really decide where you stand. I have put this in 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, a Likert scale, took an average and talked about it. It's not that there's a right or wrong to the average. It's you got to get, if you're going to put whatever rating you give on that, you have to be able to justify that.
I think going back to that empowering teachers in their PLC, um, we've been somewhat program heavy in our district for a little while now, and last year that was one of my goals, is to become more teacher centered. So it took us about a year just to kind of get my bearings. So at the beginning of this year, we focused a little more on some district PLCs, and especially in a small rural district, we can kind of get away with that, because I mean, you might only have 1 or 2 teachers at a school, so that doesn't a lot of times equate to a good sized PLC. So we've tackled both Math 1 and Earth Science as well, or I'm sorry, not Earth Science, Math 1 and 8th grade science and biology this year. And I'm using my central office staff to support, but I've also included the principals. And really the central office staff is just laying the groundwork and then getting out of the way. The principal is just kind of overseeing the work and is responsible for the product of the work. But we've been very impressed in what those teachers have came back with. Of course, we stacked the deck a little bit and made sure that we had the right folks leading those groups. But now what I'm in the process of doing is talking with the other principals about taking on those leadership roles so we can branch out and have more of those PLCs. Because what we found is everything was being left to instructional facilitators, and they can't facilitate all the PLCs that they need to facilitate. So I'm excited about the work that we're doing there. It's gonna and it falls right in line with what you were showing there on your slide, specifically about the teacher empowerment piece. I'd love to get to the point where those are self-sustaining. I think we're really close in a couple of them, where the principal's just kind of getting out of the way, and now we're focusing more so on the product that we're seeing. The outcome of the meeting is what's being monitored, rather than having to actually monitor the meetings.
I would agree with you too, but from theory plus the practical side of what you're seeing. I've been in a number of your schools, and I've seen some change since y'all started doing that as well. We underestimate the power of teachers and the ability of teachers sometimes, because we're so used to managing people instead of leading and setting up that environment for which they can take charge. And I really think public education is in deep trouble if we don't get more teachers stepping up and taking charge of their own learning.
I feel like we're going to have to, because we're turning over so many teachers that the only way to keep that capacity is for them to have that team. If they're turning over, if you've got a 6 or 7 person team and you're turning over 2 people a year, and I don't think Montgomery County is the only place that's happening. I think that's happening in a lot of places.
Yeah.
And then we're trying to get them replaced, and with those PLCs ongoing, and truly a PLC like it should be, the materials are getting developed, the pacing's getting looked at, the standards are getting addressed, the CFAs are in place for those folks. I mean, they're getting a lot of work done. And when a new person jumps on board, they know that we're only going to go for about 2 weeks before we have another conversation with this group. So I think that's something we've got to work hard to implement. It's going to take everybody. Everybody's going to have a hand in it to get it done.
It changes our routines and it changes our expectations of each other. That's difficult for some of us who've been around for a while, that we're used to doing things a certain way. and we got to get rid of that mentality that we're infringing on other people's time. We're actually helping each other. In the long run, it'll get more effective, but it'll also be more enjoyable by those people. And you got a great opportunity with your consolidation thing there, putting it together to narrow that focus a little bit. Obviously changes diversity a little bit, but that'll be good too.
I think we've had in the 2 middle school meetings with Math 1 and the 8th grade science particularly, those groups have just kind of gravitated to each other. And I believe it's that they've not done a whole lot of work where the 2 middle schools have came together. So that's been good. And it's one of those where there's been so much competition between the 2 schools. And we've kind of broken down some of those barriers as well. So I look forward to it.
Good. I've got one other thing I want to do. I think I'll put it off next week. Let's go a bit earlier tonight. This identifying learning behaviors has several embedded videos in it. I'd like to have more group discussion with this, so I'm gonna send out a note and encourage people. We need as much participation next week as we can. You get welcome to look over this, play the YouTube, and get a feeling for it. But these are some standards for learning behaviors, and we want to talk more specifically about it because that's what your evidence that you're working on now is being able to do that, identifying where there is some curriculum gaps and being able to make some decisions. So as we look at this, I'd like for the group to begin to think, this is what I've actually, in my first project, this is actually what I saw as relates to the theoretical learning aspect, not just this is what it is kind of thing. So we'll stop there unless you have any particular needs or development, and pick this up next Wednesday night. Let me ask you something. In your last class, did y'all meet every other week or every week?
In the last class, we probably met
Just a few times, probably. Yeah.
4 times total. And then I think in our law class, I think we may have met about 4 or 5 times, somewhere in that neighborhood total.
Well, I looked at it. I caught that. I didn't catch it, so we quit last week, and somebody said, "Oh, we're meeting every week." And I said, maybe I made a mistake. It sounds like you weren't used to it. I'll adjust. I want to meet next week and get through this part, and then I'll put out where we can do alternating weeks or something along that line.
Okay. Were you able to see? Were you able to see the paper that I dropped in there?
I have not had a chance yet.
Okay.
I will, but I just haven't gotten to it yet.
No problem. I just want to make sure I was on the right track staying with that. And then the other thing, when we were talking about different curriculums that we're supposed to be presenting, I think that's due February the 5th.
Well, it wasn't curriculum as much as it was some source of information or some source of literature that you think would be valuable for us all to look at.
Gotcha. Okay.
So literature search and sharing. That's 2 weeks, right? Search for a curriculum literature source. It could be a book, an article, a study, something that you've run across or think brings value to all of us.
Gotcha. Okay.
All right.
Got it.
All right. Thanks, y'all. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
both.
All right. See you next week.
Y'all have a good night.
You
Thanks.
too. Have a good night.
Share.